And essentially, the biggest issue is, well, the market isn't there yet, while at the same time, climate science tells us it needs to be there. Otherwise, we have a big, big problem. There's no net zero without carbon removal. Like, carbon removal puts the net in net zero. I think what now being in our sixth cohort, we've worked with 120 startups. We really have seen a lot, and we've started to see patterns on the various CDR methods. The only issue with the renewable energy analogy is, we had 60 years to really kickstart and scale renewables. The first commercial solar cell was about 60 years ago. And now we're really, really at scale, right? Deploying all over the globe, and it's at cost parity, if not even cheaper. We only have 25 years at max for carbon removal. So this might also pose a limit to how much we can use the analogy, right? Because we might need to vertically integrate earlier just because the supply chain isn't there, but we need to go to market and we need to scale.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. I got to chat with the godfather of CDR in Europe, Marian Krueger. In his time running his early stage CDR accelerator called Remove, he has seen over 120 carbon removal startups doing all sorts of novel techniques. This has taught him a lot, and most importantly, given him a front seat to how far CDR has come, and not only that, but where it's going, which he shared with us on this episode. So we basically got a deep dive of someone who's both seen the past and has a pulse on the future. This one's just a cool one. I mean, Marian recently wrote some big reports on the CDR space, so he was fresh off of telling that story and got to tell it here as well. A shout out to him for being a great guest, and a shout out to you all for always tuning in. Marian is the kind of guest that makes it all worth it. Let's get into it. But before we do, we are working hard here at being the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. Recently Silas and I started putting out lists of companies to watch. So far, they've been about water tech, industrial decarb, wildfire resistance, and climate risk insurance. Check those out. You can see those in our previous posts. And if you enjoy what we do and believe in our ability to support climate tech builders, please consider becoming a subscriber. It means a lot to see you all subscribe and to see our community grow. Subscribing is such an easy way to engage and support. All you have to do is go to the Substack and subscribe from there, and it really means the world to us and helps us keep going. Anyway, you're here for Marian, so let's get into it. All right, Marian, welcome to the show. I hope I got that right. How are you?
You did. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm great. How about you?
Doing well. We're sitting a little far from each other right now, geographically. Where in the world are we finding you?
I'm based in Zurich, so indeed, this is Friday evening for me. But I'm happy to have this conversation to get started on the weekend.
Yeah, same here. And I don't think you know this, but I'm actually planning to go to a conference in Switzerland over the summer. So maybe we'll end up in familiar paths.
Absolutely, happy to show you around. There's plenty to see here.
Amazing. Well, I know who you are, but the audience doesn't. Please tell us, who are you and what do you do?
Absolutely. Yeah, my name is Marian. I co-founded and run Remove. Remove is a nonprofit organization that is focused on supporting carbon removal entrepreneurs in Europe and beyond, and building the ecosystem that these entrepreneurs need to thrive.
Your model is a very, very cool inspiration behind what you can do, taking like the traditional accelerator approach or traditional funding approach and looking at a novel context and thinking about things in a new way. I feel like I see this in philanthropy. I see this amongst founders and lending, and it's so cool to see you do it in CDR. Where did the inspiration behind this come from? And I would love to know if you have any hot takes on CDR.
I guess the inspiration came from indeed CDR being quite different from established industries and markets, right? So if you'd ask me about my hot take, it's also that, well, the CDR market basically doesn't exist, right? That's the harsh reality of carbon removal these days. It is a voluntary market, and the little bias that we have buy it for reasons that are voluntary and not core to their business. So you could argue that, well, the little market we actually have is more of a B2C market than a B2B market. Of course, companies are exchanging or transacting between each other, right? So yes, businesses to businesses, but a business that buys carbon removal these days does not need it for their operation. When Bush comes to shove, they can do without carbon removal. That's the voluntary nature of it. Rather, the ones that do buy, they buy it almost in a consumption mindset, right? They have certain preferences that they're looking to fulfill, and then they buy to make claims with it. But again, here, they don't necessarily need it. As, I don't know, if you bought a new chair for your apartment, when it came down to it, you also don't need it.
So how does that thinking, you're looking at this, maybe a market that doesn't exist, or at least if it does, it doesn't behave in the way that people think it does. How did that inform how you've made your model around supporting CDR innovations?
Yeah, I think it trickles down to a number of things, both in terms of setup as well as in the structure and coaching that we provide. So maybe let's start with the setup. As I said, we're a nonprofit. We do not take equity from the startups. Rather, we give out grants that enable them to, extend their runway and maybe do things that otherwise they wouldn't be doing. Because the market is so nascent and because it basically doesn't exist yet, the timelines for them to go to market are a lot longer, which on the one hand makes it tricky to turn it into an accelerator equity model where we take a small piece of the company initially and then hope that that will pay off later on. But it also forces us in the sort of expertise that we provide and the coaching we provide to focus on really almost like a survival thing. So a common theme that we see among startups that we work with, and that's we've backed that up with a report we did last year. We surveyed all our startups, asked them about the biggest challenges they have and the strategies they use to overcome those strategies. And essentially the biggest issue is, well, the market isn't there yet, while at the same time, climate science tells us it needs to be there. Otherwise, we have a big problem. There's no net zero without carbon removal. Like carbon removal puts the net in net zero. So startups find themselves in this weird situation where there's no market yet, but long term, the market is validated. The problem is they somehow need to find ways to survive. And that's what we work with them on a daily basis. And that's also what the program is geared towards.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that founders, although they're trying to build this, don't really see a market. I'm curious on the founder side, why are founders engaging with this in the first place then? Like, what are they inspired by? Because I'm sure a founder, hopefully, and I would assume, is very inspired by some sort of future vision of what they can get to. If they don't believe the market exists, why are they doing what they're doing?
Absolutely. I think they do trust very strongly in the potential of this market. So if I am a founder, I of course look at where the market is right now, but I'm looking at the potential of it, total addressable market. And if we believe IPCC and other climate scenarios, this will need to become an industry as big as the oil and gas industry. So just from that perspective, it's of course very interesting for founders. But beyond that, I think most to all of the founders that we work with that go into CDR, because it is so tricky and because it is so hard, they're really in it for the impact. They do it because they fundamentally agree and believe that the world needs carbon removal in order to reach net zero and to fight the climate crisis. Otherwise, quite frankly, building a startup in itself is crazy enough, right? It's hard enough. And then doing it in a market that barely exists with a lot of challenges attached to it, you really, really, really need to have strong conviction and strong purpose in what you decide to do.
That's great to hear. I mean, I feel like that's already true in climate and climate tech, and it sounds like in CDR it's even more important. I'm curious, you have a background in climate and energy, and not only that, taking that and becoming a lead of a lot of decision making around how to abate sectors, how to invest in decarbonization technologies. So with that preamble, I'd love to learn from you, how did you come across the role that you're at now? I've come across your profile in a number of different, I think, contexts that you've done, but what for you has been the main inspiration to get into the space in the first place?
Yeah, I think my work at Remove really is a culmination rather, of what I've done in the past. So my first working experience was as a founder myself. I founded a startup in the solar PV space back in the mid-2010s. We inspected and optimized large solar parks all over Europe with drones. So we had drone pilots all over Europe that if we had a park that needed inspection, we sent out. They had a particular camera that recorded images of all the solar panels in such a park. And then we had an AI in the background that analyzed the data and told you, as an operator of that park, which of your modules are malfunctioning, and what you need to do in order to maximize your yield. So that I ran for a while. After a couple of years, it got acquired. And after a short break, then I wanted to have even more immediate impact on the climate crisis, right? We were already optimizing renewables, which is great, but there was this, elephant in the room or in the atmosphere, which is CO2, and I want to directly work on it. So I ended up moving on to ETH Zurich, which I don't know how familiar your listeners are. It's sort of the MIT of Europe, if you will. Strong research university. I wasn't looking for any academic role. I'm quite far away from that, but they have this interesting, unique entity called the Sustainability and Business Lab, which is located at the university, but really acts more as a almost consultancy or a think tank, working on really hard climate problems. And there I joined to lead our decarbonization projects that we're running. So we worked with, especially the hard to abate sectors. We worked in maritime shipping, in cement, in waste to energy, with legacy players, but also with startups and the Swiss government on trying to find ways of, going down the decarbonization route and managing to decarbonize. And that also is where then the accelerator idea sort of evolved from. So where Remove evolved from. We were working at that time with the waste to energy sector in Switzerland. So we have about 32 large incinerators where both biogenic and fossil waste is being incinerated. And really the only way for them to decarbonize 100%, besides recycling, is to install CCS, carbon capture and storage. And then we realized, okay, wait, but there's biogenic emissions or biogenic waste that if we burn it and catch the CO2 and store it, that is a negative emission, right? Because the plants had originally taken up that CO2 from the atmosphere. And that was really our, introduction into carbon removal. That was 2020. And then we looked at the IPCC report and saw, we need a heck of a lot of it going forward. But besides Climeworks and carbon engineering, there was essentially no one working on this. So we saw a huge gap for something to support this budding ecosystem. No one was really doing it in right. Europe at all. So we said, this is a systemic gap. Why not go ahead and close it? And that's sort of how Remove got started in the early days, still at university. Then we took it out. Now it's its separate nonprofit.
Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. I just need a few seconds because Soma and I have two quick favors to ask. Putting out the show each week takes about 15 to 20 hours between us, so it's a lot of effort. And it would mean the world to us if you would leave a review and mention your favorite episode. Secondly, if you're not already, go over and subscribe to the podcast on Substack. The content is free, but if you like hanging out with us each week, maybe we're even the kind of guys you'd like to buy a coffee for on occasion, consider becoming a paid subscriber. For the cost of one lavender latte a month, you can help us immensely. Thank you for tuning in consistently and helping us to share our guests' stories. Now back to the show.
I feel like your experience in the hard-to-abate sectors and catalyzing the ecosystem in CDR might have some parallels, right? Because if you're talking about maritime, you're talking about freight, these are a lot of industries that are only now getting attention and now starting to get decarbonized. So CDR sounds like a similar nascent environment where there wasn't much going on. I'm curious, were there any parallels between the experiences and were there any things you took over from learning about hard-to-abate sectors and how you then revolutionized CDR in Europe, essentially?
Oh, thanks for that. I'm glad that is what we're perceived as. I think there's certain similarities that have helped us now also inform our activities on CDR. I think what is absolutely crucial in decarbonization is that you take a systemic perspective, right? So yes, it's a technological challenge, but in a lot of cases, the technologies exist and or are close to being to reaching a TRL that is really relevant to be deployed. But what matters is the system around it. So take CCS, for instance, carbon capture and storage. We've done it for a while. You can go ahead and buy a carbon capture unit off the shelf, right? There's also storage sites being developed. But the relevant thing here in between is the infrastructure part. How do you get CO2 from an incinerator in Switzerland to the North Sea coast offshore to store it? Only from a systemic perspective, you realize, okay, the infrastructure or the transport side is a bottleneck here, and how can we solve this? And this is true for carbon removal as well, right? A lot of carbon removal methods, especially on the technological end, they rely on CO2 infrastructure as well. Same goes for other carbon removal methods that rely on certain feedstocks, biomass, for instance, right? You might say, well, that biomass, we all want to take it and pyrolyze it and turn it into biochar. But there's other use cases for that biomass as well. And only if you take systemic perspective, you can assess, does it make sense to put the biochar into this pyrolysis machine? Or is it better used in sustainable aviation fuel or bioplastics, right? So really, this is core to our work at Remove is the systemic approach and trying to figure out what, beyond the tech development, what is needed in order for this industry and all the CR methods in it to thrive.
So when you're looking at the array or the portfolio of CDR technologies that you have, you're looking also from a systemic point of view. I'm sure there becomes like a really cool opportunity for you to leverage some sort of market power or market insight. You have not only interaction with one founder or one group, but multiple founders. And so I'm curious, when you're looking at it from a systemic perspective, what are you excited about within that overall system?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we have a front row seat to CDR innovation, which is absolutely amazing. Like, I wouldn't change this for any other gig. Um, I think what now being in our sixth cohort, we've worked with 120 startups. So we really have seen a lot, and we've started to see patterns on the various CDR methods, right? And what we are getting excited about more and more, and we also take into our decision making process together with our external jury, is where do we still see gaps, right? Where also our limited resources best spent from a catalytic perspective? Are they best spent on supporting the 20th startup from this CR method, or are they best spent on a gap that might seem like a moonshot, but would add to the space of carbon removal because it's something that no one has ever tried before? And our support might help us as a community, as a CR space, to either validate or invalidate that route. So it allows us, also the nonprofit setup does, to really support the moonshots and at times really crazy sounding ideas, which is great because it also challenges yourself and your preconceived notions of what carbon removal is and what it can be and cannot be.
So you mentioned you see the gaps where they exist over working with, it's incredible. Like you can say, I worked with over 120 CDR startups. Like that means quite a bit because I feel like to end up the total market size of CDR startups in the first place are probably not that big. So the percentage there that you have of the overall CD startup market, I'm sure is like very significant. But you've worked with so many startups and seen them. Where do you see gaps now?
So maybe a few. I already mentioned biomass, right? And biomass, while at times it is a free resource these days, it will become a very scarce resource going down the road. But biomass is not equal to biomass, right? So there's different kinds, and there's ones that are really hard to treat: wet biomass, contaminated biomass. And I'm really excited to see carbon removal startups that are developing methods that allow them to use this biomass because there is basically no or very little competition for it. Whereas for, say, sawmill residues or higher class biomass, wood thinnings, for instance, there's already high competition for it, right? Which, just from, again, systems perspective, we want to find the best use for a ton of biomass. And that can be carbon removal, but it doesn't necessarily need to be.
Maybe if I can jump in here, what's the difficulty of using wet and contaminated biomass right now?
So one of the most established methods in carbon removal of using biomass is pyrolysis, right? So you char biomass, you heat it up in an environment without oxygen, and it essentially turns into a form of charcoal. It's called biochar, right? Because it's based on biomass. And the end destination for that a lot of the times is as a soil amendment. So you can imagine if you have contaminated biomass, you don't necessarily want to put that on your soil, right? Because the contaminated bits will leach into the ground and you'll find it in our food in the end, right? So that's why other forms of working with that biomass, extracting the carbon, putting it somewhere safe so it's stored durably, without the contaminants having any negative side effects is absolutely crucial.
Interesting. And that could be a resource or energy intensive process, requires some novel way of figuring it out.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a few startups working on these things, which I'm very excited about. Maybe another gap, something that we started to see, which is great because I think it also shows a maturation of the market. Even though it's still early days, we're starting to see first horizontal business models, right? So initially, everyone was trying to do everything, right? A DAC company was trying to develop their DAC technology, deploy it, finance it, operate it, and also sell the credits. And now that vertical integration, right? And you need to do that. Climeworks need to do all of that because they were just the first ones and there was no one they could rely on. Now we're starting to see vertical de-integration. So we'll have project developers focused on DAC. We have platforms just focused on the sales. We have some DAC companies deciding, we're just going to develop this tech and license it. Others are going to say, we're going to be the best manufacturers of DAC, regardless of which DAC technology, which is great. And then on top of that, we're starting to see horizontal business models. So businesses that operate on several CDR methods, for instance, developing enzymes that ameliorate carbon capture in various CDR methods, in enhanced weathering, for direct air capture, as well as for BECCS. And that's really exciting.
So that's really interesting. People originally had to use people had to originally use vertical business models because they had to, because there was no other support. I'm curious from the economics point of view, why is it not advantageous to keep a vertical business model? I mean, one train of thought within traditional economics is if you go up and down your integration, you're able to save costs along the way. I guess what about CDR is making that different?
The nascency, right? The nascency and the fact that it's a startup ecosystem, right? Because resources are fundamentally constrained on startups in time and in money. You need to prioritize, and that you cannot spread yourself thin on any of these of tasks along the value chain. So ideally, you want to focus on one thing and do that very, very well. Just like in sales, you want to focus on one beachhead market, completely manage and solve that beachhead market, and then you can expand. So that doesn't mean that if you start small in one vertical, you cannot integrate after. But you shouldn't need to do all of it. I mean, look at the renewables right now, right? It's an absolutely established market. And even there, we have absolutely vertical de-integration for a number of reasons, one of them being economies of scale, right? If you're a project developer, if you focus just on that, but do that at massive scale, and everything else is handed to someone else, you can specialize in that and capture most value, drive down costs because of the economies of scale. And if we got to that point, to a degree, you can really take the renewable sector as a proxy for what carbon removal will look like eventually, right? There's still a way to go. But I think from a supply chain perspective, it's something worth looking at, whether there's things to emulate.
You said two things that I had to write down. One, it's almost like the ability for a startup to do something isolated, to focus on an isolated thing, is the lagging indicator that the industry is maturing and that it's
Yes.
working, right? The ability for them not to have to vertically integrate. If you think about like what you're conventionally thought, it's that vertical integration is good. And I think what you're saying here is, if a company gets the economies of scale, yes, it would be good. But we're having the opposite problem, which is you have to do everything in order to have something. And that's not ideal. And then you also said that renewable energy is a proxy for CDR. I mean, I love industry parallels. I feel like, you study history, you study different progressions. I think we had the founder of Mitricam, and it was so interesting to hear how much he was inspired by the semiconductor industry and the way that you have to productize manufacturing and make it more advanced. It's so cool to see your parallel with the renewable energy. I'd love to dive into that a little bit. Was that an inspiration for you in how you think about shaping the market since you are in that position, or what really guides how you analyze the future of CDR?
Several things. So I do think the renewable energy analogy works if in conversations with startup when they are trying to figure out what their individual CR method will look like going forward and what type of roles they can foresee for themselves and or for others, right? The only issue with the renewable energy analogy is that we had 60 years to really kickstart and scale renewables, right? The first commercial solar cell was about 60 years ago, and now we're really, really at scale, right? Deploying all over the globe, and it's at cost parity, if not even cheaper. We only have 25 years at max for carbon removal. So this might also pose a limit to how much we can use the analogy, right? It's because we might need to vertically integrate earlier just because the supply chain isn't there, but we need to go to market and we need to scale. Might happen, right? So I think sort of optimization or perfect can be the enemy of the good or of the fast and scale here. So I think that's one thing. The other one is, again, systemic perspective. On carbon removal, we will not have one technology or two technologies delivering the 10 gigatons. It just won't. All of them are fundamentally constrained by things, be that storage space, be that renewable energy supply, be that biomass, be that land, or money, funds available for it. So we consciously think about, and this is not only us, there's a lot of smart people in the space thinking about how does the quote unquote optimal portfolio of carbon removal look like in 2050, given all the resources that we have. And this then, if you want to do it the right way, of course, becomes a massive modeling exercise, which we're not the right ones to do. But luckily, people are doing, and folks like at Frontier, the big AMC that a lot of the Silicon Valley tech companies have subscribed to, they're thinking about this very systemically and trying to essentially model Frontier's portfolio in the way that they see the portfolio in 2050 globally look like. And yeah, it's something that we, of course, take inspiration from and then also give our input in. We very closely work with them together. We bring them in for expert sessions. So I think that's in general a good, I love it about the carbon removal space. It's so nascent and early that even between companies that are working on the same CR method, there basically is no sense of competition, which I find refreshing, amazing, and speaks to the quality and integrity of the founders.
I mean, it's almost like you get to create the market, right? You're in a market creation step, which is you're taking on the risk and the difficulty to create the market. But I mean, it's almost like what happened with venture capital, or to use again the reference of semiconductors, to be first and to get that knowledge, you basically become a conduit for the innovation of CDR for the rest of your professional career, you know, if you so choose to stay in it. So I can clearly see the vision there. That's super cool. There are so many different types of CDR methods and techniques. And as someone who is not necessarily a CDR expert, it's hard for me to understand all of them. And I'm sure for a CDR expert, it's probably hard to explain all of them. But what are maybe sort of the top few CDR methods and techniques that people should know?
Yeah, maybe a good proxy for this. And together with the ETH colleague, we just published a book on carbon removal in German, which is sort of geared towards corporates. So this is an exercise we've actually just gone through. How do we explain the variety of carbon removal to an audience that might have had their last interaction with physics, chemistry, biology, let alone a combination of them, in 10th grade? So I think a good baseline is to say there's fundamentally two carbon cycles, one fast one and one slow one. Fast one is really where photosynthesis is the big driver. Plants take up CO2 while they grow, and then these plants also give it up either by composting, by burning down, or by us as humans or other animals eating them and then extracting the CO2 again. So that's the short carbon cycle. There's a range of CR methods that store CO2 temporarily through that carbon cycle. You think about afforestation, right? Or regenerative agriculture, so increasing soil carbon in the ground. It's great. We need to do all of that. It has its limits when it comes to the durability of the carbon storage, because if you imagine we afforest a piece of land and the forest stands for 10 years and then it burns down, carbon is re-emitted again. Then we have the other carbon cycle, which is the long geologic carbon cycle, right? This is where the carbon is typically stored for thousands of years, if not millennia, typically then in, as it says, geologic formations. And here, the most prominent solutions would be direct air capture, which I'm sure some of your listeners are already familiar with, right? Almost like a big fan that captures air, has a chemical in it or electrochemical processes that selectively react with the CO2, and then at the end we have air without CO2 coming out again. We also have things such as enhanced weathering, where we take silicate rocks that are alkaline, we grind them very thin to increase the surface area, and then we spread them out. And what happens then is, when it rains, the rain takes up a bit of CO2 that is in the air. It hits these very, very thinly dispersed rocks, and it reacts with the alkaline rocks. Why? Because the rain is a little bit sour when it comes to the pH. It then binds, mineralizes to these rocks, and they end up leaching to the ocean as bicarbonate. It's a form of carbon storage that is probably the most secure you can find for millennia. And then there's various shapes of this in between. There's ocean alkalinity enhancement, where you spread these alkaline materials in the ocean. There's also electrochemical ways of this. So there's loads of flavors, but fundamentally you would distinguish between methods that operate in the short carbon cycle with a temporary CO2 storage, and in a long geologic carbon cycle with almost permanent or highly durable storage capacity.
That was super helpful. So you're looking at the two methods, slow and fast. I think there's a lot of questions about carbon modeling that come into here, how little we know about some carbon modeling and the implications that has for how you evaluate and support different CDR methods. How do you, as a portfolio manager of, many, many different CDR startups, how do you balance in your evaluation process the balance between investing in fast versus slow CDR methods?
It's difficult. So first of all, I want to say we're agnostic, right? So we really are agnostic. We look at any carbon removal technology because we fundamentally believe we need all of it, right? No singular carbon removal method, or also only investing in high durability or temporal carbon removal will get us there. We need to do afforestation for a number of reasons, carbon removal being one of them, but also for its co-benefits on ecosystem restoration, on delivering economic outcomes for the communities that are there, right? So the main lens we take at this, and we have an external jury that supports us in the selection process, is really this catalytic perspective that I looked at before. So because our resources as a nonprofit are limited, we ask ourselves, how much would supporting this startup, how much would financially granting this startup support the carbon removal field as a whole? And that is one of the criteria we look at. And of course, we look at other ones which any VC would also be looking at. Right? How is the team? Do we believe there's already some initial traction? Is the tech de-risked enough to the degree that we feel, okay, we're happy to take a lot of risk because, fundamentally we don't have an equity stake, but still needs to be some proof points, right? To believe the team is well equipped to deploy it, and all of these things that any VC or also philanthropy will.
We've had a lot of really great guests who talk about investing in CDR. TerraSet is one that you might have come across. They're a great group. We had Adam on to talk about that. We also had Thomas Balazs from the Rockefeller Foundation giving some of his perspectives. So we've had a very rich perspective collectively on this topic. I still think that as a host who gets to talk to them, it's super hard to break down what someone who doesn't know a lot about CDR, what we should be paying attention to, and what is the optimal way for us to get engaged. Because I may not have the expertise and the perspective to know what nascent technologies to fund, right? And what things are cutting edge. So I'm curious, as now flipping it to more of you're a nonprofit, so that might also bring a lot of cool partnership opportunities. As a thought leader in the space and a partner as a nonprofit, how do you engage with other funders who are less CDR experts but looking to get into the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a number of avenues. One, where because we have this front row seat, we're always happy and are doing that with the philanthropic partners that we have currently already, to share sort of lessons from the front lines, right? Things that we see that everyone else in the market might only see half year down the line, and in how far that can also inform either their investment theories or also their sort of systemic efforts when it comes to supporting other grantees. I think a second line of thought is around policy, because we have a very good idea on what the sector, especially suppliers, which in essence, there will be no sector if there are no suppliers and they don't manage and make it, what they need. So that is something that, because a lot of other partners and philanthropies have very good ties to either they support advocacy organizations that we also closely work with, or they themselves do advocacy through official or unofficial channels, we can sort of relay what the startups would wish for policy to do and work on. And quite frankly, it's also an elephant in the room in carbon removal, although certainly it gets talked about more and more. This is a policy game. We will not reach gigatons in a voluntary market setting. No way. This will slowly need to become first a compliance market integrated market, and then eventually carbon removal will likely become a public good that governments pay for. And we will not get there without the right policy instruments being put into place at the right time. And here, in my mind, together with sort of supporting the earliest days of innovation with work that we do, philanthropies play a huge role in making sure that the messages reach the right people through the right organization.
I think ending on policy is actually really, really keen. I know somehow we're coming up on the end, and I like genuinely don't want this to stop. But policy is really interesting. What are you seeing as the major policy challenges ahead of us in the CDR space?
I think it's maybe if you took the easiest way, the easiest framework is here to look at supply and demand. Right, we already established demand is an issue. Right, no one really needs carbon removal right now. So, in that reality, policy can, on the one hand, create demand side on the corporates by quasi-regulation or regulation, by forcing companies to needing to buy carbon removal. Right now, a lot of that guidance is placed in sort of actors like Science-Based Target Initiative or other standards that are sort of quasi-regulating the space. But if a government said companies in our nation or the EU said companies in the EU ought to buy carbon removal if they're, for instance, in a compliance regime, that would, of course, massively change the game. Absolute game changer on the demand side. On the supply side, early stage financing support, as I think the US is showing right now, we would need to see that elsewhere as well, right? Europe is working very closely and strongly on the regulatory side, so making sure there's methodologies in place to define what carbon removal is, what carbon removal isn't, and how we can measure, report, and verify what carbon removal is and what carbon removal isn't. The US has a bit of a different approach. They are really focused on supporting early stage carbon removal with a lot of incentives, be that through deployment schemes, be that through actual government procurement of credits. So I'd love to see more of that in the EU as well. And to a degree, I mean, both approaches are complementary. Probably the regulatory issues or the regulatory things happening on the European side will sort of be taken over by the US. And I hope that the Europe can take quite some inspiration from the incentive schemes that have been put into place in the US. And let's not forget about one thing. If carbon removal is to become a gigaton industry, the Global South is playing an absolutely crucial role. And not just from there's opportunities for us to deploy, but this can be an instrument of climate justice, right? The Global South are those areas where, they're affected by the climate crisis the most and have had the fewest sort of effect on it. So beyond just sort of adaptation in the Global South, carbon removal can be a vehicle for value creation to happen there. Beyond just deployment, right? We're going to kick off a program in India in fall of this year to kickstart CDR entrepreneurship in India with local partners, just to make sure that, it's not just European or US companies going to India to deploy their tech, but to make sure that, the Indian founders are actually the ones developing the tech that is being deployed in India and maybe elsewhere as well, right? So really, this needs to become a globalized industry.
Wow. I think the thing that really stands out to me is I was speaking with some people from One Earth recently, and all of the different types of ways you talk about people not knowing what is actual like carbon removal. It's so interesting that even biodiversity, there's a case to be made, or ecosystem preservation, there's a case to be made of how you do that and how that can result in more carbon removal, and the fact that that's not conventionally understood as a CDR technology. I mean, there's so much more room that has to be done in terms of creating the market around what do we actually define as CDR and how do we quantify it. But you having a front seat and being able to break it down with us was an absolute pleasure. I genuinely don't know how it's time to basically wrap this up, but I really, really thank you so much for your time. I'm looking now 7 pages of notes just on the CDR space that I didn't have before. So this was a phenomenal episode. But we'd love to give back to the founders who are listening, the people who are listening, especially having seen over 120 CDR startups. We'd love to end the show on what are 3 things that founders can do or have done to impress you?
I think one immediately comes to mind because, we work with the founders day in and day out, and the ones that really, really impress are the ones that are good at prioritization. It's not something really surprising, but fundamentally, startups are constrained by resources, mostly time. And the good ones really manage to prioritize and focus, which is hard in carbon removal, right? Because you sort of need to look left and right because the market isn't there and somehow you need to get revenue in. But like when we work with them and they come with a structured milestone plan, they say, okay, this is what we're going to achieve in 6 months. These are the resources we need for it. We're laser focused on this. But then also have the flexibility to that. I'm very impressed by that. This goes for any startup, but I think it's especially crucial in carbon removal or in climate tech in general. I think the second one, which might be a bit more climate tech and even carbon removal specific, is I have been really impressed by the ones that have sort of used universities not as a baggage, but as asset, right? In a lot of cases, because carbon removal, as other climate tech as well, is quite tech heavy and it involves a lot of spin outs, and spin outs, unfortunately, lead to weird cap tables because a lot of sort of entrepreneurship centers at universities haven't quite understood how cap tables work going forward. And I've been really impressed by the founders that not only have managed a solid cap table that's investable, but also that have continued to use the university to their advantage, right? By being part of research projects that have essentially funded their complete tech roadmap and even their first deployments up to first of a kind, right? That is, I'm really, really, really impressed by the ones that manage to do that, because I think it's a resource that is often not untapped, remains untapped. So if you leave university and at that point that chapter is closed, well, you should keep that book open and eventually, occasionally look into it and see whether there's interesting bits and pieces that might help you down the line. Yeah, maybe as a third one, also not necessarily carbon removal specific, but it's something that we have been impressed lately by the ones that were part of our earliest cohorts and that now are reaching Series A and beyond. The ones that succeed and prevail are the ones that really hire for A teams, that are not making any compromises in their hiring, and that even develop hiring processes that you sort of are on par with the McKinseys of this world, where you'd think, well, this is overkill for a company of 12 people. But no, it really isn't. If you look at their team and what they managed to achieve with that team, it is fundamentally because they go through this process and they only hire the best. So I think those two things are probably ones that I continuously am impressed by our founders.
Those are fantastic. Be good at prioritization, use universities as assets, and hire A teams. I think that's a recipe for success. Well, Marian, thank you so much for coming. I think this is the perfect place to end it. Before we close out, where can the audience find you?
We're at remove.global, also on LinkedIn. Happy to collaborate with anyone work on carbon removal and beyond, whether that be in India and Europe. We really are very collaborative. We're a nonprofit, so also relying on partners to support our work. If any of your listeners are interested in collaborating, just shoot us a message on LinkedIn. Also happy to engage via email, marian@remove.global. So hit us up.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Welcome back to the takeaway section. I'm actually recording this a few days after my recording with Marian, so this will really be what I took away from the episode. Let's get into it. The first thing I'll say is his energy and enthusiasm were palpable. We were really able to go back and forth on his views as an industry expert, and it's clear how much innovation he can see and how passionate he is about moving the space forward. I felt like that kind of energy is infectious, and it's what you need from an investor and a market mover like he is, whose responsibility it is to convince others to get more funding into the space. I thought that was incredible. The second thing that stood out to me is the idea that current day climate tech companies have to create vertical business models to survive. That is, that they have to conquer multiple parts of the supply chain because they don't already exist. This is a point I've heard in different ways, and Marian saying it made me think about, I feel like this could be a great lagging indicator of progress. Meaning, especially in a position like Marian's, he's seeing a lot of founders, especially at the early stage, and understanding how they believe they can succeed. If founders start believing that they can succeed with horizontal business models, aka business models that only do one or two things, versus having to do what he said Climeworks does, which is go up and down the entire vertical supply chain, I think that's a great indication of progress. And the last thing is, it's really cool to see their focus on policy support. I mean, it's a topic that I really love learning about, and it's partly because policy can tell you what's working as well as what hasn't worked. as many great policies as there are a lot of policies that haven't worked yet. And oftentimes it's because the technology isn't mature, customer sentiment is lacking, or something is just misaligned in terms of incentives and action. And I think digging deep into that always reveals something that's underlying within the industry. I think their policy approach is exactly that. They're able to use policy, they understand it, and it's helping them understand where the industry needs to go. I mean, I thought this episode was incredible. I hope you all heard it in our voices and on audio if you're on YouTube. Again, thank you all so much for making this possible. I feel like talking to Marian was a real CDR extraordinaire, and it was a fantastic opportunity. Anyway, till next time.